Hello, today we're going to be learning about the stages of cognitive development. So in this episode, you'll first learn about Jean Piaget, the psychologist who developed the theory. Then I'll provide a brief overview of the stages of cognitive development and the progress that occurs in each stage. And finally, we'll apply these stages of cognitive development to instruction in higher education. So by the end of this episode, you should be able to identify the 4 stages of cognitive development and to be able to provide your own examples of how these stages of cognitive development apply to teaching in higher education. So let's begin with Jean Piaget. He was born in 1896 and he passed away in 1980. He was a Swiss psychologist who earned his doctorate in 1919, so you can do the math there and recognize that he was pretty young when he actually earned his doctorate. He was in his early 20s. But he began teaching in a university and developed a real interest in children and the way that they thought, so he intently studied his own 3 children. And most of Piaget's theories actually were based on his 3 children. It's one of the big criticisms of his thinking is that people just felt that he didn't have a large enough sample size, that it was just too small of a sample to base all these theories on only 3 children. But obviously we're still talking about Jean Piaget today, so he was a very important figure and had a lot of good thinking. He felt that children were like little scientists and that they explored the world around them in order to make sense of it. And he also didn't think that children were less intelligent than adults. He just simply thought that they thought differently. So he believed that children went through these 4 stages of development in how they understood the world around them. So that they began in the sensory motor stage, which occurred from about birth to 2 years old. Then they went into the pre-operational stage, which was about 2 years old to 7 years old. Then they move into the concrete operational stage, which happened around 7 to 12 years old. And then finally they go into the operational stage, which happens after 12 years old. So I'll break down each of these stages and we can kind of understand what happens developmentally in each of these stages. So we'll begin with the sensory motor stage. And there were basically 6 steps in the sensory motor stage, and I won't go into all of the details of these, but basically, newborns have reflexes and that they can root and they can grasp, and in this area around here, they begin to learn that certain behaviors can produce desired results. So if I cry, mom will come and pick me up. And then finally, in this area up here, they have what we call deferred imitation, in that they can see a behavior and repeat it days later. But the real capstone achievement in this stage is the idea of object permanence, in which objects continue to exist even if we can't see them. And if you've ever played peekaboo with a child, you know this concept very well, in that if you hide behind a blanket or behind your hands, the child thinks that you've disappeared. But around this 8 to 12 years, 8 to 12 months old, they begin to understand that objects are still there even if you can't see them. And then after this, they move into the pre-operational stage, and in this stage, Piaget focused a lot on what children cannot do, and he came up with 2 big concepts that they aren't able to do. The first one is the idea of conservation, and that they can't mentally manipulate information. So they don't understand that things can change in appearance and maintain the same properties. And I have a good YouTube video that I think demonstrates this really well, so I'm going to show that.
Can you look at these 2 glasses? Do you think that they have the same amount of juice? You think they have the same? Okay. Now we're going to pour this juice into this glass. Now, do you think that this glass has more juice? This glass has more juice? Or do you think that they have the same amount?
That one has more.
This one has more? And why do you think that this one has more?
Because it's taller.
Okay, you ready? Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters? Or do they have the same?
1, 2, 3. One, two, three, four, five.
So you can see from that video that the children there couldn't understand that just because things changed in appearance that they actually maintained the same properties. So this is the idea of conservation, and children in the ages of 2 to 7 don't really understand this concept. They also don't understand what Piaget called egocentrism, and that they couldn't take another person's point of view. So I also have a video to demonstrate this concept.
Can you tell me what you see when you look at that from where you're sitting? What are some of the things that you see?
A cat.
A cat.
And a tree. And a ball.
Okay, now we're going to do the same thing. Can you tell me what you see when you look at it from that stool?
An owl.
An owl. What is that?
A goat.
A goat. Okay, is there anything else you see? Right there, what is that?
A tree.
A tree. Another little tree. Right. And can you tell me what I see when I look at this from where I'm sitting right here?
Owl.
Okay.
And a goat.
Mm-hmm.
And a little tree. And that. And that.
Okay, so can you tell me what you see from that side?
A fox and a bone and a volcano
Yeah.
and a rock and a big fat Christmas tree.
Now, Braxton, can you tell me what I see from where I'm sitting?
A bird and a river and a volcano and a horsey and a rock and a tree.
So I think you could see from that video the concept here that Piaget was talking about with egocentrism, in that children can't see that someone else might see things differently from them. So those were the two kind of big concepts that children in pre-operational stage didn't understand: the idea of conservation and the idea of egocentrism. But in this stage, children can do a lot of things. This is actually the stage where they begin to develop language and an imagination, so that they learn through imitation and through playing pretend. You know, they recognize that symbols can represent objects. So, you know, they understand that a broom can be a horse, or that a hairbrush can be a microphone. So a lot of things actually do begin to develop in this stage, even though there's some big concepts that they don't quite understand yet. So then children move into the concrete operational stage. And in this stage, they have, you know, greater mental operations and functions, but they still have difficulty understanding abstract or hypothetical situations. So they're pretty good at inductive reasoning and going from the more specific to the more broad. You know, so they understand that if this dog has 4 legs and if that dog has 4 legs, then every dog must have 4 legs. But they're not so good at deductive reasoning. So from going from the more broad to the more general. So, you know, if all dogs are mammals and all mammals have fur, therefore all dogs must have fur. They would not be as good at solving that kind of riddle, because they just don't have the ability to think that way yet. They're just not as good at decision making. So, you know, they can kind of sort and classify information, but they just can't think abstractly or hypothetically. But in this stage, you know, they do begin to get the ideas that we previously talked about, the idea of conservation. And they're also understanding more about reversibility. So they understand that objects can change shape and actions can be reversed. So I can inflate an air balloon with air and then deflate it and it's still a balloon. Or I can take Play-Doh and roll it into a ball and it's still Play-Doh. So these are the types of things that the types of developmental functions that begin to develop in these stages. And then finally we move into the operational stage, and this is where they do begin to develop abstract thinking. So, you know, before everything was based on, you know, all your learning was based on previous experiences, and now children are much better at considering outcomes and consequences. So they don't necessarily have to touch a hot stove to know that it's hot. They can be much more thoughtful about that. You know, and previously everything was based on trial and error, and now they have a much more logical or methodical way of thinking. So Piaget believed that cognitive development, these stages, were really important to teaching and instruction. And so there are 4 real concrete things that kind of come out of the stages of cognitive development that apply to instruction. So the first is to focus on children's thinking. So to focus on, the actual processes and not so much on the products and the outcomes, but to understand, the way that children think and how they understand material. That's really more important for learning than the actual outcome. Also focusing on children's active participation in learning, so encouraging discovery, learning, and interaction with the environment, and that these are the types of experiences that make learning more meaningful. And also to teach children as if they're children, not as if they're adults. So, remember Piaget was Swiss, and his real big criticism of Americans was that he felt that too often Americans tried to speed up their children's thinking, that they wanted to always speed up their learning. And he felt that was really detrimental to learning, and that you might as well not teach a child at all if you're going to take on that mentality. And finally, to recognize that every child is different. So Piaget believed that children pass through these 4 stages, but he felt that the children pass through them at different rates, and so that not necessarily every child was in the same developmental place at the same time. And so, that's why there were those ranges from 0 to 2 and 2 to 7 and 7 to 12, but there's some latitude in those because not necessarily every child is in the same stage at the same time. So if, for example, if you're teaching a second grade classroom, you might have some children in the first stage and you might have some children in the second stage. So an idea that not everyone is in the same place at the same time. So I want you to think for a minute and to think about how these theories apply to teaching and higher education. So, think about the idea that maybe there should be more small groups and individual learning, because not every student is in the same place at the same time. Or even assessments, that maybe assessments shouldn't be individual progress, but, they should be individual progress, but not necessarily a comparison of how peers are doing, against one another. And whenever I asked my peers this question, I thought that they had some really great kind of interpretation of how they apply these stages in their own instruction. And some of the, for example, if you are teaching a foreign language, it doesn't matter how old perhaps your student is, because they still sort of have to go through the same thought process and the same ways of learning. So, I think we often think of the stages of cognitive development as more of a type of theory that applies to children, but it's really interesting to think about how we can apply it in higher education as well, because there are some real implications when we talk about teaching fundamental concepts to adults. And so finally, I just want to leave you with this quote. I thought it was a really nice way to sum up Piaget's whole theory. He was ordained as the father of constructivism, and he had a real emphasis on discovery learning, and that each child is unique. And so I thought this was just a nice quote to leave you with. And in the last few minutes that we have, if you could flip over your piece of paper and write down the 4 stages of cognitive development, and you can pause the video to do that, and then I'll provide you with the answers, and we'll see how many you got right. So hopefully you wrote down the sensory motor stage, the pre-operational stage, the concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage. Thank you very much.